People always ask me what it's really like, standing guard at Thornwood Palace. They think it's all polished boots and a stiff back. They think we're statues. And most days, honestly, that's exactly what we're trained to be. You stand. You breathe slow. You let the whole world walk past you like you're part of the wall. But there was one morning I'll carry with me until the day I die. One morning where the wall cracked, where I stopped being a statue and became a man again, just for a few minutes. I've never told this story properly before. I'm telling it now because I think it matters. Because people remember the late Queen of Aldermere for her crowns and her speeches and the way she waved from the long balcony. But they don't know about the locket, and they certainly don't know about the little girl who held it. Let me take you back. It was a gray morning in early autumn, the kind of gray that hangs low over the gardens and makes everything feel quiet, like the whole kingdom is still half asleep. The leaves had just started turning. There were these big copper-colored leaves drifting down across the courtyard, and one of them landed right on the toe of my boot and just sat there. I remember staring at it. You're not supposed to move when you're on post, so I just watched it, this little copper leaf, balanced on my boot like it had chosen me. Funny, the things you remember. I'd been with the Royal Guard of Aldermere for 9 years by then. 9 years standing the same posts, walking the same drills, learning to disappear inside the uniform. My name's Hadley, though nobody much used my first name back then. In the Guard, you're a surname and a number. You're a function. And I was good at the function. I prided myself on it. That morning I was posted near the East Colonnade, the long stone walkway that runs along the side of the private gardens. It's not a spot the tourists ever see. It's tucked behind the main wing, half hidden by the old yew hedges that the gardeners have been clipping into shape for longer than I've been alive. The public never comes that far in. It's a quiet post. Sometimes the only sound for an hour is the wind moving through the yews and the far-off rumble of the city beyond the walls. I liked the East Colonnade. It gave a man room to think. The palace itself was in mourning in a way that never quite ended. Old Queen Eleanora had passed the winter before. Nearly a year gone, and you could still feel it in the place. Hard to explain. The staff moved a little softer. The flags had only just come back up to full height. The whole household carried this hush about it, like a house where someone has been ill for a long, long time, and then the illness finally stops, and the silence afterward is somehow worse than the noise. Queen Eleanora had reigned over Aldermere for 51 years. 51. Most of the kingdom had never known another monarch. She'd been on the throne when their parents were children. She was the kind of queen people felt they knew, even though hardly any of them had ever stood within 10 feet of her. She had a way about her, a warmth that came through even on the grainy old broadcasts. And she had a granddaughter, a little one, Princess Liora. Liora was 6 years old that autumn. 6, and already she'd lost the grandmother she adored. The two of them had been closer than anyone outside the household really understood. The old queen used to keep the little princess with her in the afternoons, in the small sunroom off the library, and the two of them would sit there for hours. Nobody quite knew what they did in there. Read, I suppose. Talked. The queen taught her the names of the birds that came to the garden feeders. I'd heard that from one of the kitchen maids, who'd heard it from a chambermaid, the way all news travels in a palace. When the queen passed, the little girl went quiet, properly quiet, the kind of quiet a child shouldn't be. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So that gray morning, the copper leaf on my boot, the yews whispering. I'd been on post maybe 40 minutes when I first heard it. A sound, very small, carried on the wind from somewhere down past the end of the colonnade, where the stone walkway opens out into the old rose garden. At first I thought it was a bird. We get all sorts in those gardens, wrens, thrushes, the odd pigeon that flaps about like it owns the place. I thought it was just a bird and I let it go. But then I heard it again, and it wasn't a bird. It was a child crying. Now you have to understand something about the Guard. We are trained, drilled, really drilled until it's bone deep not to react, Not to turn our heads, not to break post. A loud noise, a shout, a tourist screaming for a photo, none of it is supposed to move us. We hold the line, that's the whole point of us. We are the constant thing while the world does whatever the world does. So I stood there and I held my post, and I let that small crying sound drift up the colonnade toward me. And I told myself it wasn't my concern. Someone would see to it. A nanny, a maid, somebody. There were dozens of staff in the palace. It wasn't my place. My place was on this stone, facing forward, doing my function. But the crying didn't stop. It got worse, if anything. It went from those little hiccupy sobs into something deeper, something that made my chest go tight under the wool of my tunic. You know the difference when you hear it. The difference between a child who's fallen and scraped a knee and a child who is properly, genuinely heartbroken. One is loud and passes quick. The other is quieter and goes on and on because there's no quick fix for it, no plaster you can put on it. This was the second kind. I stood there, eyes forward, jaw set, doing my function. And I'm not ashamed to tell you, my eyes started to sting. Because I knew. Some part of me already knew whose voice that was. There was only one child small enough and sad enough to be making that sound in that garden, alone, on a gray morning when the rest of the household was busy elsewhere. A minute passed, maybe two, the longest 2 minutes of my life up to that point. And then I did something I had never done in 9 years of service. Not once. I broke post. I won't pretend it was some grand, heroic decision. It wasn't. It was the opposite of a decision, really. My feet just moved. One moment I was a statue and the next I was walking, my boots loud on the old stone, down the length of the colonnade toward the rose garden, toward that sound. I told myself I was just going to check, just to make sure a child wasn't hurt. That's a guard's duty too, after all. The safety of the household comes before any drill. That's what I told myself. And it was even partly true. But mostly, I just couldn't stand there and listen to it anymore. The rose garden in autumn isn't much to look at. The roses are mostly gone by then, just the hips left, those little red berries on the bare stems, and the beds turned over dark and damp. There's a stone bench at the far end, under an old arch that's covered in climbing roses in the summer but was bare that morning, a sad sort of arch with nothing growing on it. And there on the bench was the little princess. She was so small. That's the thing that hit me first. I'd seen her before, of course, from a distance, always from a distance, a little figure being walked across a courtyard or handed up into a car, but I'd never been close. And up close she was just tiny. 6 years old and swallowed up in a dark blue coat that was a size too big for her, the sleeves coming down nearly over her hands. Her shoes didn't reach the ground from the bench. They just dangled there. She had her head down. Dark hair, a bit messy, like nobody had brushed it that morning, or like she'd been pulling at it. And she was holding something in both hands, cupped close to her chest, the way you'd hold a baby bird you found fallen from a nest. She didn't see me at first. I stopped a few feet away, and for a second I had no idea what to do. None at all. I'm a guard. I'm trained for intruders, for crowds, for the 1,000 things that might go wrong on a public day. Nobody ever trained me for this. Nobody ever sat me down and said, "Hadley, one morning you're going to find a heartbroken little girl crying in the rose garden, and here's what you say." So I just stood there like a fool, in my big ceremonial coat, feeling about as useful as that bare arch. And then she looked up. I'll never forget her face, streaked with tears, her little nose red, her eyes huge and wet and so terribly, terribly old. That's the only way I can describe it. She had old eyes that morning, the eyes of someone who's lost something they can never get back, sitting in the face of a 6-year-old who should have been worrying about nothing more than which biscuit to have at tea time. She looked at me, this enormous guard suddenly standing over her. And I thought she'd be frightened. I braced for it. I thought she'd cry harder or run or call for someone. But she didn't. She just looked at me for a long moment, and then in this small wet voice she said, Are you going to tell me I have to stop? That broke something in me. I don't mind admitting it. No, I said. My voice came out rough. No, I'm not going to tell you that. She blinked. A fat tear rolled off her chin and dropped onto the dark blue of her coat. Everyone tells me I have to stop, she said. They say it's been long enough. They say I'm a big girl now. I crouched down, slowly, the way you'd lower yourself in front of a frightened animal, careful not to make any sudden moves. My knees cracked, they always do, and I rested down on one knee on the damp stone so my face was nearer her level. So I wasn't this great looming tower above her anymore, just a man on his knee in a garden. You don't have to stop on my account, I said. You take all the time you need. And she looked at me with those old, wet eyes, like she couldn't quite believe a grown-up had just said that to her. Then she opened her hands. In them was a locket. I knew it the moment I saw it. Everyone in the household knew that locket. It was the old Queen's, gold worn smooth at the edges from 50 years of being held and turned over in her fingers, a small oval thing on a fine chain with a pattern on the front that had half rubbed away. Queen Eleanora had worn it every single day of her reign. There were photographs of her wearing it going back decades, at the coronation, at weddings, at funerals, at the long balcony waving. Always that locket at her throat. She'd never told anyone what was inside it. That was part of the legend of the thing. 51 years and not a soul knew what picture, what little secret the old queen kept against her heart. And now it was in the cupped hands of a crying 6-year-old in the rose garden. That's the queen's locket, I said softly. Your grandmother's. The little princess nodded, her chin wobbled. She gave it to me, she whispered. Before, when she was poorly, she put it in my hand and she closed my fingers up round it and she said it was mine now. She said as long as I had it, she'd never really be gone. Her voice cracked right down the middle. But she is gone. She is gone and the locket's just a locket and it doesn't talk back and it doesn't smell like her anymore and I can't. And then she couldn't say any more because the sobs came back, the deep ones, the heartbroken ones, and she just folded forward over the locket and shook. I have stood guard through a great many things in my life. I have stood through driving rain that soaked me to the skin and never moved a muscle. I have stood through a summer heat that had men fainting in their boots. I have stood through a bomb scare once, early in my service, holding my post while everyone around me ran because that's what we do, that's the whole of what we are. But I have never in my life felt as helpless as I did kneeling in front of that little girl, while she cried over her grandmother's locket. I didn't know what to do with my hands. They felt enormous and clumsy. I wanted to reach out to pat her shoulder, something, anything, but there are rules. You don't touch a member of the royal household. You just don't. It's drilled into you from the very first day. Keep your distance. Know your place. You are furniture, Hadley, fine furniture, but furniture all the same. So I knelt there with my useless hands and I let her cry. And the gray morning hung over us both, and the bare rose stems dripped, and somewhere far off a thrush was singing like the world hadn't broken. And after a while, I don't know how long, she lifted her head again, worn out, the way children are after a really good cry, all wrung out and quiet. She looked at the locket in her hands, then she looked at me. Did you know her? She asked. My grandmother, the Queen. Now here's the thing. In 9 years, I'd been within 10 feet of Queen Eleanora maybe a dozen times. She'd never once spoken to me. To her, I'd have been one of 100 guards, all the same, all interchangeable. I doubt she could have picked me out of a lineup. But once, just once, early on a winter morning years back, I'd been on a post near the private chapel, and she'd come past unexpectedly, no entourage, just her, walking alone in the cold. And as she passed me, she'd stopped, just for a second. And she'd looked up at me. She was a small woman, the old Queen, smaller than you'd think, and she'd said, "Cold one this morning, isn't it?" And then she'd smiled and walked on. That was all, 8 words, "Cold one this morning, isn't it?" and a smile. I'd carried those 8 words around for years like they were treasure. Because for 1 second, The Queen of Aldermere had looked at me and seen a person standing in the cold, not a piece of furniture, and it had meant more to me than I could ever explain. So when the little princess asked me, "Did you know her?" I had a choice. I could have said the truthful, sensible thing. "No, Your Highness, I'm only a guard. I never really knew Her Majesty." But I looked at that small, wrung-out face, and I thought about those 8 words, and I made a different choice. "A little," I said. "I knew her a little." Her eyes came up, sharp and hungry, like I'd offered her food after a long hunger. "What was she like?" she whispered. "Tell me what she was like. Everyone just says she was a great queen. I don't want to know about the great queen. I want to know about her." And I realized, kneeling there in the damp, that this little girl wasn't really asking me a question. She was asking me to give her grandmother back, just for a minute, just a small piece of her. And I knew I had to get it right. I had no idea, that gray morning, what was about to happen. I didn't know that within the hour, half the household would be turned upside down looking for the missing princess. I didn't know there'd be questions and consequences, and a moment where I'd have to stand in front of people far above my station and answer for breaking post. I didn't know that this small, quiet thing in the rose garden was going to change the whole course of my life in the guard. All I knew in that moment was that a child was asking me to tell her about her grandmother. So I took a breath, and I started to tell her, I didn't really know where to begin. You'd think 8 words wouldn't give a man much to work with. But it's funny, when something matters enough to you, you can build a whole world out of a single moment. And I'd had years to turn that one cold morning over in my head. "Well," I said, "I'll tell you something not many people know. Your grandmother used to walk the gardens alone early before anyone else was up, before the staff, before the breakfast trolleys, before any of it, just her, while the rest of the palace was still snoring." The little princess went very still, listening with her whole body, the way only children can. "How early?" she whispered. "Oh, very early, the sky still gray-blue, frost on the grass sometimes so her footprints would show behind her this little trail across the lawn, and she'd walk slow, hands behind her back, looking at things, the birds mostly. She loved the birds." "She taught me the birds," the princess said, almost too quiet to hear. "The little brown one with the loud voice, the wren." "That's right," I said, though I'd had no idea, not really, but I'd seen the feeders. I'd seen the old queen pause by them on that cold morning, so it wasn't a lie. It was just a guess that happened to land true. She knew all their names. And do you know what I always thought watching her out there? I thought, there's a woman who's the most important person in the whole kingdom, and here she is at 6 in the morning all on her own talking to wrens. Like none of the rest of it mattered half so much. The princess looked down at the locket in her hands. "It didn't," she said. "She told me that once. She said the crown was just a hat, a very heavy hat that gave her headaches." And then, and I wasn't ready for this, she gave the smallest laugh. Wet and broken, but a laugh all the same. She used to say her crown gave her headaches and she'd rather have a nice cup of tea. I laughed too, I couldn't help it, because it sounded exactly like something the old queen would say. That dry little way she had. You could hear it in the broadcasts, that humor underneath the dignity. "That sounds like her," I said. And just like that, the air around us changed. I can't explain it any better than that. One minute we were 2 strangers in a sad garden, a great clumsy guard and a heartbroken child. And the next we were just 2 people who'd both loved the same woman, swapping little pieces of her back and forth like cards. A walk in the frost from me. A heavy hat from her, a wren from both of us. She wasn't crying anymore. That was the thing. Somewhere in the middle of the talking, the crying had stopped. Her face was still streaked and her nose was still red, but the deep, heartbroken shaking had passed. She was just listening now, listening and remembering. That's a thing I learned that morning that I've never forgotten. When somebody's drowning in grief, you don't always have to pull them out of it. Sometimes you just have to get in the water with them. Sit there alongside them in the deep part, so they're not in it alone. I didn't know that before that morning. The guard never taught me that. A 6-year-old taught me that on a stone bench under a bare arch. "Tell me another one," she said. So I did. I told her about the time, and this one I'd actually seen with my own eyes. The time a great gust of wind had whipped a state document right out of an official's hands during an outdoor ceremony and sent it skidding across the courtyard, and the whole stiff, serious lot of them had stood there frozen, not knowing what to do. And the old queen, 70-odd years old, had simply stepped down, walked over and put her foot on it, pinned it under her shoe, then looked up at all those flustered officials with one eyebrow raised, as if to say, "Well, are you going to pick it up or not?" The whole courtyard had nearly burst trying not to laugh. The princess loved that one. She made me tell it twice. She was funny, she said, fierce and proud, like she needed me to know it. Everybody thinks queens aren't funny, but she was. She was the funniest person. "I believe it," I said. Nobody talks about that now. Her face clouded over again, that quick way children's faces do, sun and then shadow. They only talk about the sad parts, the funeral and the flags and how she was a great queen and we must all be brave. Nobody talks about the funny parts. It's like the funny her already disappeared, like she's getting more and more gone every day. And she clutched the locket tighter against her chest. "That's why I come here," she said, "to remember her bits before they all go, but it's getting harder. I can't remember her voice properly anymore. I try and it comes out wrong in my head." Her chin started to wobble again. "What if I forget her face? What if one day I can't remember her face at all?" I want to tell you I had something wise to say to that. I didn't. I'm a guard, not a poet. There's no good answer to a child afraid of forgetting someone she loves. There just isn't. So I told her the only true thing I could think of. "You won't," I said. "And do you know how I know? Because you're working at it. You're sitting out here in the cold, holding her locket, telling me about wrens and heavy hats and a state paper pinned under a royal shoe. People only lose the ones they stop reaching for. And you're reaching, aren't you? You're reaching with both hands, so you won't lose her. I promise you that." She looked at me for a long, long moment. And then she did something that nearly finished me off entirely. She reached out this tiny hand and she put it on my arm, on the sleeve of my coat, just for a second. The thing you're never, ever allowed to do, a member of the household touching a guard, or the other way round, and she did it backwards. She reached out and touched me, like I was a person and not furniture. "Thank you," she said. "You're the first one who didn't tell me to stop." And I'm a grown man, and I'd stood guard through rain and heat and a bomb scare, and I had to look away at the bare rose stems and blink hard, because I would not cry in front of a 6-year-old princess in a garden. That's when I heard the voices. They came from up the colonnade, sharp, urgent, carrying on the gray air, more than one of them, the particular pitch of a household that started to panic. "Not in the nursery. Check the library again. How long has she?" And then a name, called out down the long stone walkway, bouncing off the old yews. "Princess Liora, Liora." The little girl's whole body went tight. Her hand came off my arm. The shadow swallowed up the small bit of sun I'd managed to bring back to her face, and just like that she was a frightened child again, caught somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. "They're looking for me," she whispered. "I'm not allowed to be out here on my own. I'm going to be in trouble, and you—" her eyes went huge. "You're going to be in trouble. You left your standing place, didn't you, because of me?" And there it was, out of the mouth of a 6-year-old, the exact size of what I'd done. Because she was right. I had broken post. 9 years of unblemished service, and I'd walked off my station and left it empty and come down here into the gardens. And now there were household officials coming round the hedge any second, and they were going to find a guard out of position, kneeling in the roses with the missing princess, who'd been gone long enough that the whole wing was in an uproar. There's no good way to dress that up. In the guard, your post is sacred. You do not leave it. Men have been disciplined, dismissed. drummed out for far less than what I'd done. I knew it even as I'd done it, somewhere underneath, but I'd done it anyway. And now the bill was coming due. I'll be honest with you. For one cold second, fear ran right through me. 9 years. My whole life, really. I'd joined the Guard at 18 and never known anything else. My uniform, my post, my place in the world. All of it possibly gone because I couldn't stand to listen to a child cry. And then I looked at her face. That small, frightened, tear-streaked face, terrified that she'd got me in trouble, worried about me. 6 years old and worried about the big, clumsy Guard. And the fear just went. I can't explain it. It just drained right out of me. "Hey," I said, quiet, steady, "look at me." She looked. "You are not in trouble," I said, "and neither am I, do you understand? Whatever happens next, you didn't do anything wrong. You came out to remember your grandmother. There's nothing wrong in that, nothing in the world. You let me worry about the standing place. That's a grown-up problem and I'll deal with it. All right." She didn't look like she believed me. Children can smell a comforting lie a mile off. "All right," she said anyway, because she was kind and she could tell I needed her to say it. The voices were close now, just the other side of the yew hedge, any second. And I made my second decision of the morning, the one that mattered even more than the first. I stood up, slow, to my full height in my full coat, and I turned myself to face the gap in the hedge where they'd come through, and I put myself between the princess and whoever was about to round that corner. Not hiding her, you couldn't hide her and I wouldn't have tried, but standing in front of her, squared up, so that the first thing those officials saw when they came round the hedge wasn't a frightened little girl who'd run off and broken the rules. It was a Guard, standing at attention, as if this were exactly where he was meant to be. If anyone was going to take the weight of this, it was going to be me, not her. She'd carried enough. They came round the hedge in a knot, 3 of them. A household steward I knew by sight, a stiff gray-suited man named Mr. Aldous who ran half the private wing and frightened the junior staff half to death. A nursery maid, young, white-faced, clearly the one who'd lost track of the princess and was about to lose her position over it. And behind them, hurrying, slightly out of breath, the controller of the household himself, Sir Edmund Vane, the most senior man in the whole palace below the family itself. A tall, severe figure with silver hair and a face like a closed door. If the controller had come down personally, this was serious. This had gone all the way up. They stopped dead when they saw us. For a moment, nobody said anything. The whole garden held its breath. The thrush had stopped singing. There was just the drip of the bare stems and the 4 of them staring at me, this Guard, out of position, standing over the missing princess like he'd grown up out of the stones. Mr. Aldous found his voice first, and it was not kind. "Guardsman," cold as the frost, "explain yourself. What in heaven's name are you doing off your post?" I opened my mouth, and before I could get a single word out, a small voice spoke up from behind me. "It's not his fault." Princess Liora stepped out from behind my leg, stood right beside me, this tiny figure next to the great dark column of my coat, and she lifted her chin and faced down the most senior men in the entire household, with her grandmother's locket clutched in both fists. "I came out here on my own," she said, her voice shaking but climbing, getting steadier with every word. "I didn't tell anyone. That's against the rules, and I knew it was, and I did it anyway. And he," she pointed up at me, "he was just standing at his place doing his job, and he heard me crying, and he came to make sure I was safe. Because that's a Guard's job, to keep me safe. And he did. He kept me safe. So if anyone's in trouble, it's me, not him, and you're not allowed to be cross with him. There are moments in your life you know you'll remember forever, even while they're still happening. This was one of them. This tiny 6-year-old, who 20 minutes ago had been folded over a bench shaking with grief, standing up straight as a soldier and defending a Guard she'd known for less than half an hour, in front of the most powerful men in the palace. Sir Edmund Vane, the controller, hadn't said a word this whole time. He'd just been watching the princess, watching me, those door-shut eyes taking it all in. Now he held up one hand, the smallest gesture, and Mr. Aldous, mid-bluster, shut his mouth like a trap. The controller stepped forward, past the steward, past the white-faced nursery maid. He came right up to the princess, and then, slowly, with a care that surprised me, he lowered himself down. This tall, severe old man, folding himself down onto one knee in the damp just as I had, so he was at her level. "Your Highness," he said, and his voice wasn't cold at all, it was gentle. "May I see what you're holding?" The princess hesitated, then she opened her hands. And the locket lay there, gold, worn smooth. Queen Eleanora's locket, the one she'd worn every day for 51 years, the one with the secret inside it that not a soul had ever known. Sir Edmund Vane looked at it for a long, long moment, and I watched something move across that closed-door face, something cracking open just slightly, just a hair. "I served your grandmother for 38 years, he said quietly. "I was a young man when I came to her household, younger than this guardsman here. He didn't look up at me, but I understood the courtesy in it that he'd named me in a way, made me a person and not just an out-of-position uniform. And in all that time, Your Highness, I never once saw her without that locket, not once. She wore it the day I started. She wore it the day—" His voice caught just slightly. He cleared his throat. "She wore it to the very end." The princess stared at him. "You knew her too," she whispered. "I did," he said. "We all did, everyone in this house. We all lost her." He looked round at the others, then at Aldous, at the steward, at the trembling young nursery maid. "And perhaps," he said, slower now, "perhaps we have all been so busy being brave about it and keeping the household running and minding the rules that we forgot the one person in this palace who is allowed to simply miss her grandmother, out loud, in a garden, on a gray morning." Nobody said anything. The young nursery maid had started to cry, very quietly, the kind you try to hide. And the controller turned, finally, and looked up at me. I stood at attention, eyes forward, braced for whatever came. "Guardsman," he said, "you left your post." "Yes, sir," I said, "I did." "You know what that means?" "Yes, sir." He held my eyes for a long moment. And then, I'll never forget it, the smallest thing happened at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. Sir Edmund Vane was not a smiling man, but something, some softening at the very edge. "We'll discuss it," he said, "inside, out of the cold." And that was all. "We'll discuss it inside. Not you're dismissed. Not report to my office. Not the words I'd been bracing for. We'll discuss it inside, out of the cold, which is, if you think about it, almost exactly the kind of thing a certain old queen might have said to a guardsman on a frosty morning, years ago, just before she smiled and walked on. I didn't know yet what was coming. I didn't know what would be decided inside, out of the cold, whether I'd keep my post or lose it, whether 9 years would count for anything against one broken rule. But the princess slipped her small hand into mine, right there, in front of everyone, the thing you're never allowed, and she held on tight. And she looked up at me. "You're not in trouble," she told me, fierce, certain. "I won't let you be." And somehow, looking down at her, I believed her. They took us inside. Not to some cold office, the way I'd feared. The controller led us through a side door into the private wing, down a corridor I'd walked past 100 times on patrol but never once entered, and into the small sunroom off the library. The moment we stepped in, I felt the princess's hand tighten in mine. Because this was the room. I understood it straight away. This was where she'd spent all those afternoons with her grandmother. You could feel it. There were 2 chairs by the window, an old worn one and a smaller one beside it, set close together the way they'd been left. A blanket folded over the arm. A little table between them with a chess set on it, half a game still set up, the pieces gathering dust where nobody had dared to move them. And the window looked out over the gardens, over the very feeders where the wrens came. Nobody had touched this room since the old queen died. You could tell. It had been left exactly as she'd kept it, like the whole palace was holding its breath, waiting for her to come back and finish the chess game. The princess stopped in the doorway, just stopped, staring at the two chairs. "I'm not allowed in here," she whispered. "They locked it, after, they said it was to keep it nice." Her voice went very small. "I think they locked it so I'd stop coming." And I felt that land in the room like a stone dropped in a still pond. Because of course they had. They'd locked away the one place she could still feel her grandmother, thinking they were protecting her, thinking that if they just kept the door shut the grief would stay shut behind it too. The young nursery maid made a small sound. The steward looked at the floor. Sir Edmund Vane stood very still in the middle of that room full of dust and held breath, and then he walked over to the window. He stood there a moment, looking out at the feeders, and when he turned back around, the closed door of his face had come open the rest of the way. "This room," he said slowly, "was the happiest place in this palace for 50 years. There was more laughter in this little room than in all the great halls put together." He looked at the two chairs. "Her Majesty asked me once why I always looked so worried. I told her it was my job to worry so that she didn't have to. And she said," he stopped and I watched the old man swallow, "she said, 'Edmund, when I'm gone, do me one kindness. Don't let them turn this place into a museum.' A museum is just a room where the living aren't allowed." He went quiet. "And then I went and did exactly the thing she told me not to," he said. "I locked the door, I kept it nice, I made it a museum." He looked at the princess. "Forgive an old man, Your Highness, I got it wrong. I got it badly wrong." He crossed the room, and he did something I never imagined I'd see the controller of the household do. He knelt down in front of the little princess a second time, there in the dusty sun room, and he took her free hand, the one not still holding mine, very gently in both of his. "This is your room too," he said. "It always was. You may come here whenever you wish. Morning, afternoon, the middle of the night if you need to. Nobody will lock it again. Nobody will tell you to stop. You come here and you remember her as much and as often as your heart needs to. That is an order from me, and I outrank everyone in this house but your own family. Do you understand?" The princess nodded. Her eyes had filled up again, but it was different this time. Not the drowning kind, the other kind. "Can I bring the locket?" she asked. "You may keep the locket always," he said. "It's yours. She gave it to you herself." And then the princess did the thing that I think none of us were ready for. She looked down at the locket in her hand, and she said in this small, clear voice, "Do you know what's inside it?" The whole room went still. Because nobody did. That was the legend of the thing, wasn't it? 51 years on the old queen's throat, and not a single soul in the world knew what picture, what secret, she kept folded up against her heart. There'd been guesses for decades. The late king, people said, or her mother, or some lost love from before the crown. Half the kingdom had a theory. None of them knew. And here was a 6-year-old girl, holding the answer in her fist, looking up at the most senior man in the palace. Sir Edmund Vane's voice came out very quiet. "No, Your Highness, I confess I never did. In 38 years I never once dared to ask." "She showed me," the princess said, "at the end, when she gave it to me. She opened it up and she showed me, and she said now I'd know the secret and I had to keep it safe." She looked round at all of us, the controller on his knee, the steward, the weeping nursery maid, and me, the great clumsy guard who'd started all this by breaking his post over the sound of a child crying. "Do you want to see?" she asked. And not one of us could speak. We just nodded, every one of us, like children ourselves. The princess worked the little clasp with her small fingers. It was stiff, 50 years stiff, and for a moment I thought she wouldn't manage it. But then it gave, with a tiny click that sounded enormous in that silent room. And the locket fell open. Inside, on one side, there was a photograph. Old, faded. A black and white snap of a young woman I didn't recognize at first, a girl, really, no older than 20, laughing at whoever held the camera, her hair blowing across her face. It took me a second, and then I understood. It was the Queen, Queen Eleanora before she was queen. Before the crown, before the heavy hat that gave her headaches, before 51 years of standing on balconies and pinning state papers under her shoe. Just a girl, laughing, with the wind in her hair. But it was the other side that finished us. The other side of the locket wasn't a photograph. It was a tiny folded scrap of paper, soft and worn from years of being opened and read and folded up again. The princess unfolded it with the greatest care and held it up so we could all see. It was a child's drawing, crayon, faded almost to nothing. A wobbly little house, a wobbly little sun, two stick figures holding hands, a big one and a small one, and underneath, in the careful, uneven letters of a child just learning to write, 3 words. For Granny, loved Liora. I made it for her, the princess whispered. When I was little, I didn't even remember making it. I was 3, she said. I gave it to her and she put it in her locket and she wore it every single day after that and she never told anyone. Her voice broke clean in half. She wore me, next to her picture, every day, for 3 years. She wore me right next to her heart and nobody knew. The young nursery maid was crying openly now. The steward had turned away to the window, his shoulders not quite steady. And Sir Edmund Vane, controller of the household, 38 years in service, that severe old man with the closed-door face, Sir Edmund Vane bowed his silver head and wept, right there on his knees in the dusty sunroom. He didn't try to hide it. He just let it come. Because all those years the whole kingdom had wondered what the old queen kept so close. Her late husband, they guessed, some grand romance, some weight of state, something fitting for a monarch of 51 years. And it was a crayon drawing from a 3-year-old, a wobbly house and a wobbly sun and 2 stick figures holding hands. That's what she'd carried against her heart, every single day, under every crown and through every ceremony. Not the weight of the kingdom. Her grandchild's love, that was all, that was everything. I had to look away. I looked out the window at the feeders at the gray morning and I let my own eyes sting and spill and I didn't fight it, not anymore. Because there's no shame in it. There's no shame in any of it. I'll tell you how it ended. We didn't discuss the broken post that day. We didn't discuss it the next day either. In fact, Sir Edmund Vane never once raised it again, not directly. But about a week later I was called to his office, and I went up those stairs certain that this was it. This was the reckoning finally come. He had me stand in front of his great desk. He looked at me a long while over his folded hands, and then he said, "Guardsman Hadley, I've been thinking about what to do with a man who walks off his sacred post in the middle of his watch." "Yes, sir," I said, bracing. "A man like that," he went on, "clearly cannot be trusted to stand and do nothing while something in front of him needs doing." A pause. "Which makes him, I should think, exactly the wrong sort of man to leave standing alone on a wall." I didn't follow. I said nothing. "Her Highness has asked for you specifically," he said. "By name. She would like, when she is in the gardens or the sun-room or anywhere she goes about the grounds, to have a particular guardsman nearby, one she trusts, one who, in her words," and here the old man almost smiled, "didn't tell me to stop." I couldn't speak. I genuinely couldn't. "It is not a punishment," he said, "though I'll grant you it's an unusual sort of reward, watching over one small girl when you might have a grand post on the front gate. The choice is yours, Hadley. You may return to the wall with no mark against your record, I'll see to that. Or you may take this. Think on it." I didn't need to think on it. "I'll take it, sir," I said. "Of course I'll take it." "I rather thought you might," he said. That was 4 years ago now. The princess is 10 today. Tall for 10, getting taller all the time. She'll be looking me in the eye before long, the cheek of it. She's not the quiet, folded-over little thing she was that gray morning. She laughs now. Properly. That dry humor she got from her grandmother, the heavy-hat humor, it comes out of her at the strangest moments and catches you off guard and you can't help but laugh along. She still has the locket. She still goes to the sun-room. The door stays open now always. Nobody's ever locked it again. She does her schoolwork in there sometimes at the little table where the half-finished chess game used to be. She finished the game, actually. Played it out herself, both sides, the way she imagined her grandmother would have moved. She won't tell anyone who won, says that's between her and Granny. And me, I'm still there. Still in my coat, still on my post, just a different sort of post now. A few feet from a girl instead of on a cold wall. People who don't know the story look at me funny sometimes, this big guard following a young princess about the gardens. They probably think I drew the short straw. They don't know. They don't know about the gray morning, or the rose garden, or the sound of a child crying that I couldn't stand to ignore. They don't know it's the proudest post in the whole palace, as far as I'm concerned. Every so often, when she's having a hard day, and she still does, you don't stop missing someone, you just learn to carry it, she'll come and stand next to me on my post. Doesn't say anything. Just stands there alongside me for a while, the two of us looking out over the gardens. And after a bit she'll go off again, lighter. Because I learned that, didn't I, that gray morning 4 years ago. When somebody's drowning, you don't always have to pull them out. Sometimes you just get in the water beside them, so they're not in the deep part alone. A 6-year-old taught me that, on a stone bench, under a bare arch, with her grandmother's whole secret heart held tight in both her hands. And I think about the old queen sometimes, walking her gardens in the frost, talking to the wrens, with a crayon house and a wobbly sun folded up against her chest. The most important woman in the kingdom, carrying the only thing that ever really mattered to her right there where her heart was, where it was warmest. We spend so much of our lives guarding the wrong things. The walls, the gates, the crowns and the heavy hats, standing watch over all of it, telling ourselves that's the job, that's what matters, that's what we're for. And all the while, the thing actually worth guarding is small enough to fold up and tuck away. You just have to be willing to break post when you hear it crying.